so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
They're great, aren't they?
Now, Microsoft founder Bill Gates has spent years investing in the work to rid the world of infection diseases like malaria and Ebola. Now he's turning his attention to coronavirus.
Yes, in an exclusive TV interview with BBC Breakfast, he's been telling us how he believes that the only way to beat it is if scientists around the world work together. Before we hear from Bill Gates, let's take a look at the work he's been doing. Bill Gates is the world's second richest man. He was one of the founders of the computer giant Microsoft. By the age of 31, he had become the youngest ever self-made billionaire. He stepped down from running Microsoft in 2008 to focus on his charity, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of the projects they helped launch is CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. It works to find vaccines for new infectious diseases.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war.
In a TED Talk 5 years ago, he warned that the world wasn't ready for an epidemic.
But we need to get going because time is not on our side. In fact, if there's one positive thing that can come out of the Ebola epidemic, it's that it can serve as an early warning, a wake-up call to get ready.
CEPI is now working on a coronavirus vaccine, but scientists expect it to take up to 18 months for an effective treatment to be ready.
Earlier this week, Bill Gates spoke exclusively to Breakfast's Charlie Stay about the race to create a coronavirus vaccine.
Bill Gates, thank you very much for joining us on BBC Breakfast. I just wonder if I could first ask you, how important is it now to have a global response?
Well, I'd say it's critical because the tools that are going to reduce deaths, the drugs, that's a global thing to get those out. And the thing that'll get us back to the world that we had before coronavirus is the vaccine and getting that out to all 7 billion people. And so the efforts to test those, to build the factories, to understand, is it safe and ready to go? That's a global problem. And, so I'm glad, that people are coming together to find where is the best work and combine that. The factory will be in a different country than the science is in. This is the whole world working on probably the most urgent tool that's ever been needed.
Can I ask you to just reflect a little more on the way that world leaders thus far have responded to the crisis?
Well, there's the period when I and other health experts were saying that this is the greatest potential downfall the world faced, going back quite a ways with a speech in 2015 and a New England Journal of Medicine article about the specific thing. So, we definitely will look back and wish we had invested more so that we could quickly have all the diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. So, we underinvested, which was my goal, was to get that to happen. We did do CEPI, which helped with some of the vaccine platforms, but not even 5% of what we could have done. Then there's the period where the virus shows up in those first few months. What were the tests prepared? Did countries think through getting their ICU and ventilator capacity up? There'll be time for those postmortems. Very few countries are going to get an A grade for what that scrambling looked like. And now here we are. We didn't simulate this. We didn't practice. So both the health policies and economic policies, we find ourselves in uncharted territory.
I know one of the messages you're very keen to put out there is about that there should be more international cooperation. Can you try and give us a sense of what that you think should look like in practice?
Well, the coronavirus is going through waves. The first wave was very much China. And now there's a wave that almost all of the rich countries are experiencing very challenging epidemics. Hopefully by early summer, if the right type of isolation policies and testing policies have been implemented, a lot of the countries will be beyond the peak and looking at opening back up. Sadly, the developing countries, who as yet don't have a huge number of cases, are likely to have the worst of it because their ability to isolate, the capacity of their health system is far less than in the rich countries. And so the global cooperation is to help those countries and by helping them make sure the disease isn't spreading back to the other countries, and then to supercharge the therapeutics and vaccine work, which will involve expertise from all over the globe.
Do you think there's a very real risk then, as leaders of developed countries try and deal with the situation, the crisis in their own countries, that not enough thought will go to those places you mentioned before that at this stage possibly haven't been thought about enough?
Well, certainly, say we get a therapeutic that's partially effective, it'll be in short supply. What will the allocation be? Likewise for the vaccine. I do think that because the peak in the developing countries is coming later than in the rich countries, countries like, European countries, China, the US, we can take some of the, mask and ventilator and other things that have been ramped up and make sure that we keep making those things, but then they'll be needed. We'll have to ship those in developing countries. And we're seeing, China stepping up a bit in that way already.
When you talk about a therapeutic, you're talking about a vaccine, I'm assuming. Is that right?
No, I use therapeutic for treating somebody who's ill. So that would be like, maybe, although the evidence is very, very weak, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir. There's antivirals, antibodies, all sorts of things. The foundation created the Therapeutics Accelerator that's looking literally at thousands of things that you would give, that you treat somebody. That is only after you get sick. And of course, the vaccine is a protective to prevent you from getting sick.
Now, can I ask you, in relation to the vaccine, I know that you've donated a sum of money in relation to that. Just talk me through what do you think are the key elements around developing a successful vaccine? Is it money? Is it political will? What do you think are the key elements to that?
Well, we definitely need to fund the research and the manufacturing and the distribution. The distribution piece for developing countries will be Gavi, where the UK has always been super generous on that. The research will need to fund about the 10 most promising constructs, because we won't know in advance which one will prove to be safe and effective. And being effective for older people whose immune system is weak is a huge challenge. If you really amp up the vaccine to do that, then you can run into safety issues. So we're going to have to take something that usually takes 5 or 6 years and get it done in 18 months. There is an approach called an RNA vaccine that people like Moderna, CureVac, and several others have that looks quite promising, but we can't count on that. So we'll back, 4 or 5 of those and 4 or 5 companies using a more conventional approach, which unfortunately the schedule for that would probably not be as quick as if this RNA platform that we've been funding directly and through CEPI over the last decade.
You'll be aware a lot of people in the UK are asking what is a very simple and straightforward question, which is, when will there be a vaccine? How do you see that? Well,
it's a perfect question because we want to get back to the life we had before coronavirus. And, people are seeing the economic destruction, the psychological stress. This is such an unprecedented, very tough thing to deal with. The people like myself and Tony Fauci are saying 18 months. If everything went perfectly, we could do slightly better than that. But there will be a trade-off. We'll have less safety testing than we typically would have. And so governments will have to decide, do they indemnify the companies and really say, let's go out with this when we just don't have the time to do what we normally do. So 18 months is about what we'd expect. We're doing everything we can. We'll write checks for those factories faster than governments can, and they'll come along. It definitely shouldn't be money limited. It should be, all the best constructs, full speed ahead, science limited.
As I understand it then from what you're saying is that it may be that there needs to be some compromise in some of the safety measures that would normally be expected to create a vaccine because time is so crucial.
Well, of course, if you want to wait and see if a side effect shows up 2 years later, that takes 2 years. So whenever you're acting quickly, like during the HIV crisis, they created a quick way of getting drug approval. There is a trade-off there. In that case, it worked super, super well. And here, we will, I think, be able to get some safety indications, but this is a public good. And so, those trade-offs, the governments working on a cooperative basis will be involved in the decision to say, hey, the regulator says go ahead, even though you haven't taken the normal time period.
Do you think world leaders now are listening in a way they didn't out of necessity, bearing in mind, and I know you referenced it before, 2015 you gave one of those TED Talks, and if people go back and listen to it now, it was extraordinarily close to what is happening now. You were talking about the real risk of a pandemic across the world. Did you feel like you were listened to then?
No. The investments that could have been done so that diagnostics would have been essentially immediately available, drugs in less than half the time, the vaccine in less than half the time, most of those investments were not made. Now, CEPI is the exception to that, but that's about 5% of what could have been done. Now we're scrambling, and it's taking us much longer to get these pieces together, even though scientists are doing heroic work. So, unlike the defense budget that prepares us for wars, where we simulate the problem and we make sure we're good at it, this risk, which I viewed as even greater than the risk of war, there was very, very little preparation. Very few of these germ games where you try out and say, okay, how do you build up the ICU capacity? Can you make ventilators? How do you prioritize the diagnostics? That we're just figuring out as we go.
Do you think that, do you think, partly a financial decision, that it wasn't deemed to be worth investing that money in something that maybe other people didn't see as clearly as you?
Well, it's got to be governments because there's no private sector incentive for something that's uncertain like this. And even when it happens, you have to charge mostly a break-even price for things that are helping out with a global crisis like this. So, people still saw war as something to fund. In the less than 10% of that would have been needed for this, people just didn't organize their government to have that function. I do think now, because this has been so dramatic, we weren't ready for this pandemic, but I do think we will be ready for the next pandemic. And using the new tools of science, that's very, very doable.
Well, that really was my next question. I mean, given what you said in 2015, and you were very clear, people didn't listen. Are you optimistic that now, and obviously we need to get out of the immediate situation, but there will be a different mindset around the fears around viruses and pandemics?
Yeah, your speed of reaction is so crucial here because it grows exponentially. If you're there 2 months earlier, which some countries jumped on this faster than others, they really were checking to see if there was community spread. They got the diagnostics capacity up quickly. But, we should be able to have diagnostics within a month. We should be able to have therapeutics in more like 4 months and a vaccine less than a year if we're on standby with the right factories and the right science. And we should have rehearsed how we deal with all these shortages, with working together. So a really good system for seeing this early and making sure we jump on it before the curve gets to a meaningful part of the population, that is achievable.
I know you reflected for a moment on this earlier on in the interview, and it is inevitable that here in the UK we ask our politicians questions about the way they've reacted, and to a degree it's inevitable that that thought process will be something that happens in the future that we look back on. I mean, can you sort of talk us through what you see from what's happened so far?
Well, a big missing piece is that, you know, funding the research for these type of vaccines, you know, actually our foundation is the biggest funder of vaccines for infectious disease. You know, there could have been more. CEPI is the one thing that did happen there. And, you know, now the next phase is once we get the cases way down, how much can we open up? And that now there is an opportunity for governments to see what others are doing, to see which ones do run into a rebound of the disease, and really share these deep understandings. You know, like are young people part of the infection chain? You know, so I do think we will deal with this opening up phase in a more collaborative, data-driven way than the first scramble, where sadly, you know, many governments were slow to react.
Can I just ask you finally on a personal note? I mean, one of the things that we've all become very aware of is viruses know no boundaries, and everyone is affected. We are all human beings. And I just wonder, you know, for you, yourself, looking at what's happening around the world, and also literally in a personal sense, you know, with your friends and family, how has it been for you?
Well, I think everyone's life is completely disrupted. You know, your normal pattern of, you know, go to meetings, you know, watch sports events, this thing, you know, in my lifetime, this is the most dramatic thing. And, you know, so now we're having to think through how do we rise to the occasion, you know, get the scientists working together. I'm doing video meetings. I hardly see people at all. You know, I ask myself every morning, did this really happen? And even though I worried about it, I still find it shocking how tough it is, and how hard it's going to be to get back to the normal life that we had before.
On that note, and on that note of normal, do you think things will go back to normal, or is that all changed?
No, once you have a safe and effective vaccine and get that out to almost all of the people on the planet, and build the preparatory systems for the next pandemic, so you can nip it in the bud, we will go back to normal and economies will recover. But we have multiple stages to go through in terms of, until we have that, you know, how much can we open up? How do we help the developing countries? But the economy eventually will go back to where it was, and innovation will help us not be at such a risk in the years after that.
Bill Gates, very good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Bill Gates talking to Charlie Slate earlier in the week. Now, that's all from us here today. You can get all the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak on The Andrew Marr Show, coming up next on BBC One. Breakfast will be back tomorrow morning from 6. Enjoy the rest of your Easter Sunday. Goodbye.
Hello, squirrels. Who wants to earn their stay-at-home badge? It's really quite easy.